Okay, Doug, you can take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Teletown Hall, examining an issue that cuts to the very core of our democracy, the ability of Americans to safely cast their ballot by mail in the midst of a global pandemic, and to be confident that it will be received by election authorities on time. My name is Doug Kriner, and I'm a professor of government at Cornell University and the faculty director at the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon as we discuss policy solutions to ensure a well-functioning postal service and the key role it plays both in providing a critical service to millions of Americans, particularly in rural communities, and in safeguarding our most basic democratic right, the right to vote. I would particularly like to thank our distinguished guest, Representative Connolly, for sharing his unique insight into these questions with us this afternoon. It's now my pleasure to introduce Representative Steve Israel, our Institute Director, to get us started.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kriner. I appreciate the introduction and the work that we do together. Folks, I am so excited for you to hear from my old friend and former colleague, Congressman Gerry Connolly, who is just pivotal in the debate in Congress over the functioning of a post office in a democracy in an election year. I want to thank him for joining us. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping and then turn it right over to him because he just has so much depth and sharpness on this issue. I do want to acknowledge several former members of Congress who have joined us as participants and hope that they will ask questions or add their comments. Former Congressman Gary Ackerman, who chaired the Post Office and Civil Service Committee when it was the Post Office and Civil Service Committee. Former Congressman Ben Chandler from Kentucky, Tom Coleman, a Republican from Missouri, Rush Holt of New Jersey, and former Congressman Dick Ottinger, who I had the privilege of serving as a legislative assistant back before all of these gray hairs. And also Wendy Wolford, who is the vice provost at Cornell University. Thank you all for being with us. Just so you know, we have some exciting programs coming up. I'm going to share them with you very briefly and then turn it right over to Congressman Connolly. The Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell has a very simple mission. We cultivate and nourish the next generation of public servants by curating programming to deepen discourse and raise understanding. We think of ourselves as the replenishers of democracy for the next generation. And we have had Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus. We have had Senator Klobuchar, Senator Cassidy, many members of Congress, senators and diplomats. Coming up this Thursday at 7, we have a book and author series, and our guest will be another former member of Congress, Bob Mrazek, who has written just a marvelous nonfiction called The Indomitable Florence Finch about a nurse in the Philippines during World War II and the extraordinary heroism that she demonstrated. That's The Indomitable Florence Finch this Thursday at 7. I know Congressman Connolly is an avid reader of books, so I'm going to send him a copy of Congressman Mrazek's book. On Tuesday, September 15th at noon, we're offering a panel on how we can protect and preserve our environment by the practice of rewilding wild horses in native lands. That will be with Congresswoman Betty McCollum from Minnesota. On Friday, September 18th at 2, we're doing a panel on, quote, destroying or deploying the deep state. We have a panel of experts on that topic. On Tuesday, September 22nd, fascinating program that I hope that you will attend, called Worst Case Scenarios, Planning for Potential Presidential Disruptions to the Transition Process. Our guest will be Rosa Brooks, who has convened a group of experts. They've actually simulated what we can expect to happen in the event that President Trump, if he should be defeated, and we don't know whether he will, but if he should be defeated and he says this election is a fraud or a scam, I'm not going, what are the contingencies that we should be looking at? And then finally, September 24th at 7, book and author with Rick Perlstein, the author of Reaganland, an exceptional book, and the author, Rick Perlstein, will be with us. If you want any specific information on these programs, you can just Google Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, or go right to our website at iopga@cornell.edu. Today, the future of the Postal Service in an election year with Congressman Gerry Connolly. He is serving his 6th term representing Northern Virginia. He is a senior member of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. He is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Government Ops, which has full jurisdiction for the post office. He's also a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. He's the chairman of the U.S. delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He received his MA from Harvard. Not a bad Ivy League school with Cornell. We don't mind being in their company.
I wasn't good enough to get into Cornell.
It's not too late. It's not too late. Congressman Connolly, thank you so much for joining us, and let me turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Steve. And it's such an honor to be with everybody today, including so many of our former colleagues, and especially you, Steve. I'm so proud of what Steve Israel is doing at Cornell and helping to prepare the next generation of public servants. He knows that public service is an honorable calling. I believe that. I know he does. I know Professor Kriner does as well. And thank you for what you're doing. I think it's really important. As I said, I was not good enough to go to Cornell, but at Harvard, when I got my master's, case studies were sort of the de rigueur way of teaching and learning. And the Postal Service would make a classic case study in terms of current management, in terms of what not to do. A little bit of context. The Postal Service has the largest vehicular fleet in America. Its average age is 25 to 36 years old. What could go wrong with that? It has a workforce of 630,000. It is big, it's quasi-governmental, and it's unionized, things that right-wing ideologues despise. It has a universal service mandate by law that requires it to provide service to every household and every business in America every day. It is a constitutionally mandated service. It's the only service mandated by the Constitution of the United States explicitly. And it is mandated to Congress to provide the service, to set it up and provide it. The Postal Service in America predates the Republic. And in fact, one of the great luminaries of early America, Benjamin Franklin, was an early Postmaster General and helped systematize the Postal Service because he understood it had the connective tissue for the emerging new nation. The Postal Service, despite what you've read, if we could take away the burden of the prepayment requirement, which was required by Congress in a 2006 bill called Postal Reform, but it really put the Postal Service in a straitjacket and required it to prepay all retiree health benefits at 100%. No entity on the planet is required by law to do anything like that. And that instantly meant that the Postal Service was going to face technical insolvency. It added about a $5 or $6 billion item a year to its debt, which it could not make. If we took that away in the last 5 years, despite all of its problems, the Postal Service would technically be in the black. It has been buffeted by changes in communication behavior and technology. So first-class mail has collapsed. We don't write mom anymore, a letter. We email her. And so first-class mail collapsed. Packages went up. And packages account for about 5% of the volume of the Postal Service, but it's the fastest growing, and it accounts for about 30% of its revenue. I know Gary Ackerman is on this session. I don't think Gary, and certainly not myself, would ever have dreamt that the Postal Service would be a headline issue. I mean, the Postal Service is something we all take for granted. And think about this. We're in the middle of the worst pandemic in 100 years and an economic collapse and a racial justice crisis. We can't go to work. Our kids can't go to daycare. Schools are closed. We can't go to restaurants. We're kind of cooped up in semi-quarantine right now. But the one constant in everybody's life is the mail gets delivered. Roughly the same time every day by the same postman or postwoman every day. The idea that that would be threatened wakened a sleeping giant in terms of public opinion. When you ask people, what's your approval rating of government in general, that number is 17%. When you ask, what about the Postal Service? It's plus 80. It is the highest esteemed public service in America, by far. And the idea that you would do anything to delay or disrupt that is truly a third rail in politics. We like to say Social Security, but Postal Service affects far more people than Social Security every day. And especially in the pandemic, we're reliant on it for medicine, medical equipment, foodstuffs, and other packages because we can't go to a store or don't want to. And of course, we have one other overlay, and I'll end with this, and that is the decision by the Board of Governors to hire a partisan political donor who ran his own business and sold it to be the new Postmaster General. Now, this gentleman, Mr. Louis DeJoy, was not on the search company's list of candidates. He got added. He has no qualifications for the job. He's the first Postmaster General in 30 years to have no professional experience with the Postal Service itself. The last three Postmasters General all rose through the ranks. Now, you can bring in an outsider, but how about with some qualifications and credentials? It became quite clear that Mr. DeJoy had an agenda, and that agenda was to disrupt and delay so that it could sow seeds of real doubt in the American public's mind about the reliability of the Postal Service to deliver their mail-in ballots on time. Now, 76% of all Americans favor voting by mail. 70% want the option to do it themselves, and at least 50 or 60% of Americans were planning to vote by mail in this election. It would be the biggest change in how we vote in living memory. And we're probably going to reach numbers close to that. But doubts are in people's minds because all of a sudden they were reading stories that sorting machines were being disconnected, 671 of them. Why is that important? Each sorting machine can handle 32,000 pieces of mail an hour. That means each one of those machines handles hundreds of thousands of pieces of mail a day, times 671. Times of pickup in mail drop boxes were changed. In many cases from, say, two times a day to one time a day, and from 6 days a week to 5 days a week. So if you mailed a ballot on Friday at, say, 1:30, it wouldn't even get picked up until the following Monday. So you can see, the cascading set of consequences. Overtime was stopped. Why is that important in the pandemic? Because 64,000 postal employees have either contracted COVID-19 or had to be quarantined because of exposure. Sadly, several dozen have died. So there are labor shortages all over the country, and that has to be filled by either new hires or overtime. Overtime is not just a nice thing to do, it's an essential tool in delivering the mail. And without it, when you say we're eliminating it, you guarantee there will be postal delays. So thus began a viral reaction. I mean, all of a sudden the Postal Service was the headline in every cable news show. It was the headline in every newspaper. It was the topic of congressional hearings. And the sleepy thing we kind of take for granted, all of a sudden became an issue. And Mr. DeJoy is front and center as part of that issue. And if we're going to have an election with reliability and integrity through the mail, we have to solve this problem of the delay and disruption that has begun with Mr. DeJoy's tenure. I will say he's been called by postal workers by his nickname, Mr. Delay. Anyway, why don't I stop there in terms of background and we can have this discussion. Steve, you're on mute.
Gosh,
there you go.
I'm usually the guy who says you're on mute, and I just did it to myself. I'm sorry. Very topical, very thorough briefing. Today's New York Times actually has a headline about the partisanship of the Postal Service. Let me, for the folks who are on this, it looks like we have about 154 people. I'm going to have a 10-minute conversation with the congressman, and then at about 1:55 or so, Natalie on my team will open it up to Q&A. She'll give you instructions on how to pose your questions. Congressman, you said that there was this firestorm of protests. Suddenly the Postal Service was in the headlines and just massive outrage. And I know that Mr. DeJoy, as a response to that, promised Congress that he was going to rescind some of his decisions, insisted that he is not going to do anything that would somehow inhibit the post office from processing mail-in ballots. Are you satisfied with his assurances? Has the public opinion outrage worked?
You know, it's a great question, Steve. He did issue a statement saying, wait, you know, maybe we were rushed into this. We're going to be flexible and so forth. But when you look at the fine print, as we did in the hearing where we had him for our committee, on overtime, he said, I'll be flexible. What does that mean? I mean, to me, overtime, if we can't deliver the mail without it, then we're going to have overtime. That's the commitment I want to hear. And he didn't make that commitment. With respect to restoring sorting machines, he flat out said he wouldn't do it. With respect to restoring hours of operation, he said he'd look at it. With respect to returning drop boxes, he basically said, well, we do this all the time when the volume doesn't justify their presence, and that's why we did it. So he made no commitment there either to restore drop boxes in neighborhoods all around the country, especially on the West Coast where it was most prevalent. So no, I was not satisfied. I think he played fast and loose with that so-called rescission statement. And, you know, we're going to try to nail him down in terms of specific commitments. And if he won't do that, we're going to try to hold the Board of Governors to account. Like, what are you people doing? Because under the Postal Reorganization Act, he gets hired and fired by the Postal Board of Governors, not the White House, not Congress, and he is responsible to them. He's a member of the board, but he also is responsible to them. And we want to see some oversight and accountability there.
Perfect segue into the second question about the Board of Governors. A headline in today's New York Times: Democrats fear partisan slant at Postal Service as Trump allies dominate board. The lead is a powerful but little-known group of Republican donors installed by President Trump to oversee the United States Postal Service has helped raise more than $3 million to support him and hundreds of millions more for his party over the past decade, prompting concerns about partisan bias at the agency before the November election. It goes on to say governors have done little to hide their loyalty to the president, even as the board meets behind closed doors to plot a strategy for handling what is expected to be a record crush of mail-in ballots this fall. Can you explain, Congressman, what can the Congress do to ensure that there is no partisanship in this process? How do you hold them accountable to honesty and to the basic functioning of the post office?
Well, you remember Sam Rayburn used to say, the Republicans are our adversaries, but the Senate is our enemy. It would be nice if the Senate actually took the professionalization and nonpartisanship of the Postal Service to heart and actually only confirmed people who met those broad categories, as opposed to knowingly confirming to the Board of Governors active donors of one party or the other. That is in contravention of the clear intent of Congress to depoliticize the Postal Service. In the old days, you will recall from history, Steve, that Postmasters General were members of the cabinet. They were political appointees, and they were often politicos. They were very active. Jim Farley comes to mind in the FDR administration. You know, Lawrence O'Donnell, I believe, was in that position. But at any rate, Congress consciously sought to change that. And it changed the postal status from being a cabinet governmental entity to a quasi-public entity with this Board of Governors. and to professionalize its leadership and take it out of politics. And unfortunately, what's happened in this administration is we've gone right back into the fire with blatant partisan politicos being nominated and confirmed to the Board of Governors. Now, I will say this, I don't believe that any of them, in fact, I know for a fact they're feeling the heat. They're not used to being subjects of social media criticism, emails, protests at Postal Service. I mean, post office, right? When's the last time anyone protested at a post office? I mean, draft boards, yes. Jails, yes. Police stations, yes, but post offices? So they're not used to this kind of attention and heat. And we're hoping that that will help clarify their thinking. But you're absolutely right. The process has to be changed. And I think we're going to have to, frankly, look at legislation to really tighten up the criteria for getting on that Board of Governors and how they function and what the criteria are for being a Postmaster General.
Thank you. Let's talk two more questions I think we have time for from me, and then we'll open it up. Also from the New York Times today, the issue of why you are on the Hill now. You're speaking from your home, but why is Congress in session now? And it is to do several things, but principally to pass a bill that provides additional relief as a result of COVID. So in May, the House passed a bill that was at $3.4 trillion and provided $25 billion for the post office. The Senate, so the House was at $3.4 trillion. The Senate, before they broke for the August recess, was at $1 trillion. Now you guys come back. Speaker Pelosi says, okay, we'll compromise. We'll go from 3.4 trillion to 2.2 trillion. And the Senate decides that they're not in the mood to compromise. They're going from 1 trillion to 700 billion and not doing the $25 billion in relief for the post office. That was a very long way of asking you, do you think that there can be some compromise on a final bill that does provide the post office with the funds it needs to reliably deliver mail-in ballots?
I do. You're quite right. In the HEROES Act, which we passed in May, we did two things for the Postal Service, among others, but two big things. We provided a revenue stabilization injection of $25 billion, which, by the way, was based on a unanimous recommendation of this Republican-dominated Board of Governors. Mm-hmm. That wasn't a liberal Democratic idea. That was a conservative Republican-appointed Board of Governors request. In fact, $25 billion for revenue stabilization, $25 billion for infrastructure, and a line of credit that was unfettered. So so we took care of the $25 billion for infrastructure to replace that vehicular fleet, among other investments, in the infrastructure bill we passed separately. But in the HEROES Act, we gave them the revenue of $25 billion, and we gave them unfettered access to a $10 billion line of credit, which had been in the previous CARES Act, but it had conditionality, unacceptable conditionality, in giving the Commerce Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, management review powers and pricing review powers. Now, pricing, under the law created by Congress, is the sole purview of the Postal Regulatory Commission. It is charged with looking at competitive pricing and setting a price that allows a return on investment, but that keeps the Postal Service competitive. And the reason Mnuchin wanted to do that was because Trump has been banging the drum that packages get a special deal, especially Amazon and Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post. Now, there's no truth to that at all. In fact, packages are the one part of the Postal Service that is profit-making, including Amazon. And so, at any rate, Mnuchin insisted in those conditions, which made the $10 billion line of credit, frankly, untenable. So those were the two things we did. And the White House signaled it might go along with, say, 10 billion or so line of credit, revenue, which was the first time that ice cracked. And then maybe they'd make some concessions on an unfettered access to a line of credit. So I do think this potential common ground. It is, however, as you point out, Steve, it is regression on the part of the Republican majority leader to actually pull all of that out of his so-called skinny bill. So we're back to kind of square one and trying to initiate negotiations to help the Postal Service. And if I may, a lot of my friends on the other side of the aisle like to say, well, wait a minute, they were supposed to be going deeper into the hole in the pandemic, but in fact, they have a cash balance now of $13 billion. And that's true. Two things. That's because of the upsurge in package demand that was not predicted in the pandemic. Secondly, 13 billion may sound like a lot. Their payroll every 2 weeks is 2.2 billion. So 13 billion really doesn't solve the problem, and they are expected, if nothing changes, and if the pandemic eases, to go into the red in operating because of pandemic losses, and maybe be out of cash by next spring. So we face a serious situation. It does not, however, in any way affect the ability of the Postal Service to handle voting by mail. No, if every American voted by mail, it would be comparable to holiday volume for the Postal Service, which is an upsurge that happens annually, and they handle it with aplomb. And so they are absolutely equipped to handle the upsurge in voting between now and November 3rd, which has already begun.
Great, thank you. Natalie, let's go to you. Give everybody instructions on how to ask questions. I know that Congressman Coleman has already posed a question, and I think Doug Kriner will have the first question, then Congressman Coleman. But Natalie, tell everybody what they need to do to pose their own questions, please.
Absolutely. To line up, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the raise hand function. Once you click that, it'll give a notice on our end that you have a question. And when we call on you, we can give you the function to unmute. So you'll just have to wait to be called on, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So while people line up, I can turn it over to Doug.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Congressman, for being here. We've talked a lot about legislative solutions, and I wondered if very quickly I could just ask whether you could talk a little bit more about the challenges of conducting rigorous oversight, given the litany of unprecedented problems we're facing right now, and what tools, if any, your committee needs to be able to conduct this critically important constitutional duty.
Well, that's a more complicated question than it may seem. If there are people who are confirmed in their jobs by the US Senate and an administration that are set to actually disrupt and delay the mail to limit the ability of people to vote by mail because they've got it in their heads that voting by mail is against their interests, even though ironically, the president and first lady vote by mail. And also historically, as Steve knows, Republicans have done a much better job at harvesting votes by mail early than Democrats, actually. Yeah. And it's only recently Democrats have caught up. But because of what Trump has done in saying it's fake, it's rigged, it will create massive fraud, he's persuaded the rank and file Republicans not to vote by mail. So if you look at polling right now, 60 to 70% of Democrats want to and planning to vote by mail or vote early, and only 22% are Republicans, which has people like Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House, panicking because a lot of those voters who are not voting by mail now are senior citizens. They're very reliable Republican voters. And there's a chance they won't show up on election day if that's their option because of fear of COVID-19. So anyway, look, there's moral suasion, and I think we've done a pretty good job of highlighting this issue as a major threat to the democratic process. We've had just unprecedented media attention and public response. But the second is to use the tools we've got, legislative oversight hearings, subpoenas, whatever it may be, to curb the behavior and reverse it. Now, we can't do anything about Trump personally, but we most certainly can hold the Board of Governors to account. We've already had one hearing that has now gotten the Postmaster General in trouble because he may very well have I don't want to say perjured, but certainly dissembled in his answer about straw donations at his previous company. You may have read about that. So he may be in legal jeopardy as well as clear accountability jeopardy with both Congress and the public. So we're going to keep the heat on, and we're going to do everything in our power to try to reverse it. Voting by mail is safe and reliable.
Natalie, can you call on Congressman Coleman?
Absolutely. Congressman Coleman, if you unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Great, thanks. And Steve, thank you for having these sessions, and Congressman Connolly for being direct and answering these questions. I looked up on the website of the U.S. Postal Service website, and it says that the governing body of the service is an 11-member board of governors, which you've referred to. It has a responsibility comparable to the board of directors of a publicly held corporation. My question is, in order to make sure that these people who are on the board obviously aren't qualified, does this mean that they have a fiduciary responsibility to the public? And if so, do the reforms of Sarbanes-Oxley that has been passed into law, as you know, does that apply to them and the U.S. Postal Service?
Gerry, did you hear that?
I'm afraid Tom broke up, but thank you, Tom, for your question. And I think if I get the gist of it, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, don't the members of the Board of Governors of a quasi-public entity have a fiduciary responsibility as spelled out in Sarbanes-Oxley?
Yes.
And I would say absolutely they do. And I think that is another legal method whereby we can hold them to account. And they can put themselves at legal jeopardy, frankly, if they don't meet that commitment. I think that's where you were headed, Tom, and I would agree with that. And that goes back to your question, Doug. What are the tools at our command to hold people to account?
Thank you. Natalie?
Okay, our next question comes from Wendy Abrams.
Wendy, before you unmute yourself, Wendy Abrams. Wendy is on the board of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell and involved in many national causes around the country. Wendy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting this. I don't know if it makes me feel better or worse, because I feel like we had a lot of discussion about the problem and I'm not sure I see the solution, particularly given, less than 60 days out to do that, and certainly early voting starting before then. So one is just more broadly the question, then how do we solve this? And two,
Wendy,
can you hear me?
I think Gerry may be having some bandwidth.
Wendy, you keep on breaking up.
Steve, could you hear my question?
Yeah.
I think it's us.
One is just how to solve the problem.
Can you hear me, Steve?
I can hear you, but you are breaking up. So Wendy, pause for one moment.
Okay.
I think Natalie would know. Natalie, is the congressman having some bandwidth issues?
Yes, he's just freezing up a bit.
Okay. So it is on your side, Congressman. Can you hear me? What you might want to do is just go to audio. Correct, Natalie?
Yes. If you take the video off, that will help with bandwidth.
Okay. And we'll take a little pause. Natalie, can you email the congressman's? Oh, we hear you. Natalie, would you email the congressman's staff person, Wendy?
Steve?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, Steve?
Yes.
Can I just add the second half of the question? One was just
that while we're trying to get a better connection.
One was, how do we address the issues he outlined, and the second
Wendy, you're coming through.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I was going to say, one is how do we address the questions that you outlined, but also when I get nervous because when President Trump has a tendency to suggest that his adversaries will do things that in fact he is doing. So when he says, I think that election, mail-in ballots are fraudulent, and maybe even from foreign governments. Maybe there's somebody, you know, behind the scenes who's actually planning that or thinking about it. I don't know. But I guess the question is, if you have the hands of the Postal Service, if the Postal Service is in the hands of a Trump partisan, they could deliver the ballots on time to 99.9% of Americans, but they know exactly which zip codes are Democratic strongholds that would flip the election. So if, for instance, they don't mail to Bloomfield Hills outside of Detroit, or this exact zip code in Philadelphia or Charlotte, they know where's blue and where's red. And so if that, you know, if most people get it and everyone says this went flawlessly, but, you know, 10,000 people in Michigan don't get their ballots, how do we control? Is there oversight to know that there's no shenanigans like that, that this isn't a targeted, you know, certainly the Russians could do this, and having zip codes is an easy enough way to sort.
Well, if you were planning to do something, thank you, Wendy, and I heard all of that. If you were planning to do that, sunshine like we're getting on this issue is not good. Because now everyone's onto the game. Everyone is going to be watching. And the other thing is, while the top leadership at the Postal Service may have set about to disrupt and delay, the rank and file postal workers take enormous pride in their work. They take enormous pride in prioritizing ballots. And many of the managers, local managers, have relationships, working relationships with their local electoral boards. So I know, like where I live, that's the case. So there's an absolute understanding between my electoral board and the main distributing postal office that any mail-in ballot that comes in, well, goes out or comes in, will be prioritized. And we even have cases where the Postal Service, seeing ballots, say the day before, the day of the election, we'll make a special run to our government center to deliver them so that they aren't lost. So there are going to be thousands of such transactions, making it much more difficult to disrupt that process, no matter what the intentions at the top might be. And I think that's why they're focused on logistics. So pull those sorting machines so it's harder to sort the mail, deliver less volume every day, cut back on hours, cut back on pickups, and all of that to slow. Doing it at targets is going to be a lot more difficult today than it might have been if they kept quiet about it.
Okay, thank you, Gerry. Apologies, you are breaking up from time to time. I'm not sure there's anything you can do on your end, but I know that Natalie and Wendy are trying to figure that out. Let's go to Congressman Rush Holt. Natalie?
Absolutely. Congressman Holt, if you can unmute yourself, you can ask a question.
Okay, am I coming through?
Yes.
Yes, loud and clear.
Hi, Gerry. Hi, Steve. Thanks. Gerry, it was a very
Hey, Rush.
very succinct and articulate and compelling presentation. Thank you. You made the point that except for the required prepayment, the post office is operating in the black. I'm wondering why you even bothered to say that. It seems to me we don't want to play into the conservative Republican argument here. Shouldn't we be saying the post office should not be expected to operate in the black any more than the Defense Department or the Transportation Department is expected to operate in the black?
Get that? Did you get that, Congressman? Congressman, did you get that?
I did.
Okay.
And
Not to put you on the spot, Gerry. It's just
No. It's a really good point you're making, Rush. And the only reason I make it is to debunk the fiction out there that from the president's own words, the Postal Service is a joke. they're insolvent, they're bankrupt. We need to privatize the Postal Service in order to make it viable. That is not true, even with respect to operating revenue. So they're going to go up and down. They're hard, and you're quite right. It's not a business. It's a service. It wasn't intended to be a huge profit-making enterprise. It was intended to make a go at it, you know, in terms of revenue, and don't lose a lot of money. Hopefully don't lose any, but serve the public, serve every household, serve every business. And that's the point you're making, and I agree with you. The only reason I emphasized in the last 5 or 6 years, actually they operated the black, is because despite all of the difficulties it's facing, technology, market changes, and assault on it, it actually is a going enterprise. But even if it weren't, you're right. It's there to serve the public. It's not there to make a profit like FedEx or UPS. And you know, every month, the Postal Service handles more volume in 1 month than its 2 major competitors do in a whole year. And even with the drop in first-class volume, almost half, almost 50% of all of the mail in the world goes through the United States Post Office. So the volumes we're talking about are enormous, which is another argument for why the idea that we can't handle an upsurge in mail-in ballots is not true. It's absurd.
All right, well, thank you. Folks, we have just about 15 minutes left, and I know that there are at least 4 questions in the queue. So if you have a question to ask, now is the time to let us know. And with that, Natalie, let's go back to the queue.
Great. So William Land is next. William, if you unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. This is a wonderful,
yes,
very instructive and interesting talk. Just a quick question, separate from the election, before all this concern came up with DeJoy, what were the areas of reform or change, such as changing Saturday mail or closing post offices or technological improvements, were you looking to institute?
So, yeah, I got that, William. Thank you. So the first thing we need to do, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Congressman.
William, had you finished? Okay. So the first thing we need to do is we need to take the shackles off the Postal Service that Congress itself created in the so-called 2006 reform legislation. So we need to get rid of the prepayment requirement, which is money the Postal Service owes itself. So it's kind of a ledger entry debt, but it's a real debt. And we have to alleviate them of that burden. Secondly, we need to free up the Postal Service to engage in other endeavors that could be profit-making. And not to compete with the private sector, but take advantage of the private sector. So for example, if you go to a grocery store, my grocery store, right, my local bank has a branch there. Starbucks has a kiosk there. Hallmark Cards has a kiosk there. The local florist shop contracts with My Safeway or Giant to sell flowers there. So why can't the Postal Service do something comparable? So why can't, for example, you renew your driver's license at your post office? Why can't a lot of local government transactions take place there as well as other places? But why not contract with them to do it? Why not get a cup of coffee there because Starbucks or Pete's or some other chain has got a competitive bid contract to sell its product on postal grounds? The Postal Service in almost all, and I think we need to change that. We need to let 1,000 flowers bloom to see what works and what doesn't, as has been done in Europe and other places. So that there are other lines of revenue and hopefully profit to augment postal revenue and to compensate for the loss of first-class volume and revenue. we also need, the third major reform, I think, is we've got to address infrastructure investment. I mentioned that the Postal Service has tens of thousands of vehicles. It's the largest vehicular fleet in America. Its average age is between 25 and 36 years old. They are gas guzzlers, they're inefficient, they break down, they require high maintenance, they're very costly to maintain. We have an opportunity with hybrid technology, electric vehicles for short runs, to modernize that fleet and frankly jumpstart electric and hybrid manufacturing. So, but they don't have the money to make those investments. And that's going to be easily a $6 or $7 billion investment. So that's why the Board of Governors for an additional $25 billion for infrastructure investment. They also need to invest in technology to handle volume of mail more efficiently by taking advantage of current technologies and replace sort of the clunkers from the past. So they need to do that if they're going to be competitive and if they're going to be able to keep their commitment in terms of universal mandate in any kind of reasonable way as we look to the future. Those we're looking at. There are also going to be legislative reforms in terms of management in light of what we've just experienced with the hiring of DeJoy and with the performance of this Board of Governors.
Thank you, Natalie. Next question. I see Bill Wachtel is with us.
Yes, our next question comes from Mr. Wachtel. If you unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Yes, hi, Congressman or Congressmen. Thank you. It's Bill Wachtel. I bring to today's conversation a bit of familiarity with what you just talked about, because I've been working with the Post Office for the past 4 years to bring to market a new postal vehicle. And it's been 4 years in the making, and 3 months ago, the Postal Service finally received its bids, and it now has the opportunity to select.
I am not at all.
Sorry? Can you hear me?
Jerry, we seem to have lost you again. Can you hear us? All right, Bill, why don't you do the question as we try and get Jerry back, and I can relay it to him.
Okay.
Question.
Jerry, can you, Congressman, can you hear us? The glory of live productions.
Sure. Well, why don't I do this anyway?
Okay, yeah, you ask the question, and we'll try and get him. Go ahead.
And look, Steve, I'll do this to you because in some measure, this is right up your alley. Because, you know, Grumman was the first producer of the postal vehicle based on Long Island, maybe in your district for all I know. And there were 170,000 of these iconic vehicles on the road. Frighteningly, it's costing the Postal Service today over $1 billion a year to keep those vehicles on the road. They're over 30 years old. They're not safe. But for the last 3 years, thankfully, the Postal Service, under the guidance of a very well-managed organization of production people, have ran a very tight RFP process. They have 4 different vehicles that are amongst the finalists. And I actually was given to understand that they do have the $7 billion of appropriated money to replace the vehicles. So recently, the Inspector General of the Postal Service issued a report calling into question the entire wisdom of this new program, which is called the NGDV program, New Generation Delivery Vehicle Program. So Congressman Huffman in the House has taken the lead under something known as the Fleet Act to try to make sure that not only does the program go forward, but that in fact, as Congressman Connolly mentioned, that we bring to bear vehicles which will in some measure pay for themselves. A, they won't require $6,000 or $7,000 a year for repair, and B, they'll be energy efficient. C, they will accommodate the needs of the drivers. So you should understand that the vehicles today don't have air conditioning, they're not ergonomically designed, and to put it quite bluntly, they're designed to carry letters, not packages. Yeah. So that's a topic that perhaps I can brief the Congressman on. I can get you the Inspector General's report that issued 3 weeks ago and provide whatever insights I can, because I do believe that without a new fleet, we may make it through this election cycle, but we're not going to make it much further.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, a little bit of a story. When I was first of all, I was the original author of the fleet bill you're referring to. Okay. And Jared Huffman wanted, as a freshman, to have something to, kind of make a mark. And I was happy to collaborate with him and have him take the lead. But when I was a freshman, we were doing the stimulus bill right after President Obama was sworn in to try to save the American economy. And the then head of the Postal Regulatory Commission came to me and said, couldn't we set aside some of that money to replace our fleet? And we could use a lot of it to jumpstart the electric car market. Now, you can't have one size fits all. Not every vehicle lends itself to being an electric vehicle for the Postal Service, but a big chunk of it could be, especially short haul, like suburban hauls. So I called in the then Postmaster General, Mr. Donahue, and I said, here's a proposition. What if we could set aside $5 billion for you, which was roughly the estimate at the time, for you to replace your entire fleet, and we won't earmark it, but it will be like an earmark of the $800 billion stimulus bill that we were considering. And the then Postmaster General, Mr. Donahue, said, and I quote, "We don't want to be anyone's guinea pigs, so no, thank you." So we could have had, and I think we could have sold it, don't you, Steve, at the time? Yeah. We could have easily sold that $5 billion out of $800 billion as a shovel-ready, ready to go kind of thing, and it would have been a twofer, right? It would have stimulated the economy, actually a threefer, would have stimulated the electric car market with a ready-made purchaser, and it would have completely replaced a clunky, aging, inefficient, unsafe, environmentally bad fleet. And so that it was a real opportunity lost by that Postmaster General. So we need to revisit the issue. And yeah, William, I'd welcome your sharing with me any material you might have on how best we might proceed on that.
Thank you. We'll follow up, Bill. Natalie?
Our next question comes from Roland Molina. Roland, if you can unmute yourself, please.
Thank you all for this meeting today.
Roland, I have to ask, I see your photograph. Is that you?
Yes.
Deployed where?
That was actually in Hawaii aboard USS Missouri.
A very historic ship.
Yeah.
So thank you for everything you've done for the country, Roland.
Thank you, Congressman. I very much agree with the long-term solutions. Regarding the political rhetoric or commentary that's sure to ensue post-election, given how close we are to the election, is it even realistically possible that the USPS meddling won't be blamed given another Trump victory?
That's anyone's guess, right? I mean, there's so many imponderables. Will the incumbent accept a negative result? Will there be charges that because the volume of early voting and mail-in voting is so enormous that we're not going to know the results the night of November 3rd? Will we accept the fact that the day of voting may look very different than the final tally? I'll give you an example of that. I had a primary on June 23rd. The day I vote, I won 70-30. But the mail-in vote, which was more than half of the total, almost 2/3 of the total, I won 85-15. So the final result was 78% to 22%, not 70-30. Now, we were able to count, because it was a relatively low turnout primary, we were able to count all those ballots the day of, and by 11 o'clock at night, we knew the final results. That's not going to be the case in a lot of places. Not through anyone's fault. It's just the volume, because every state has different rules about when you can process a ballot. Some states like mine, Virginia, say you can process that ballot, you just can't count it. So you can get it all ready to be put in the machine and counted that day. But once you get them, you can process them. There are other states that say you can't touch that ballot. You can't touch that ballot until polls close on election day. So because we have 50 different sets of state regulations with respect to ballots and how you treat them, we're going to have kind of a patchwork quilt of results. And some key states, we may not know that night. So will that be seized upon as, see, they're stuffing ballots? And you're right, the Postal Service may not escape blame either. My hope is for a decisive election so that the result is so clear that even with stragglers who can't announce their vote that night, it's not going to be dispositive to the result.
Congressman, we promised you a hard stop at 2:30. Now here's our dilemma. We have Congressman Ackerman and Congresswoman Esty.
Go for it.
Questions. Would you be okay to recognize both? All right.
Absolutely. I can't let my friends, Mr. Ackerman, Gary Ackerman, and Elizabeth Esty go.
All right. So Natalie, if you would unmute Congressman Ackerman, I think he had his hand up first, and then we'll go to Congresswoman Esty.
Sure. Congressman Ackerman, if you unmute, you can ask a question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Gary, it is so good to hear you.
Well, Jerry, it's good to hear you. I remember when you were a young kid and a staffer and you first came to Congress as a member, how proud I am of you. And Steve, you're still a young kid. And we're proud of everything that you're doing too. Jerry, the stuff you're doing across the board at the hearings of many types, I certainly appreciate it. Your summary is great. People underestimate the importance of the Postal Service. The Postal Service was organized by its first Postmaster General, Ben Franklin, as you mentioned. As a matter of fact, it was so important that he appears, the Postmaster General, Ben Franklin, on stamp number 1 of the United States and stamp number 2 with George Washington.
Gary, we're getting a little feedback. Did we lose you?
No, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I think you dropped off when you got to stamp 2, and we are sitting on the edges of our seats.
Stamp 2 was a minor character in American history, George Washington. Okay. But Ben Franklin actually took position number 1 in the history of the 10,000 varieties of stamps that we have in the United States. One of the things that I think people are hinting at, but not saying outright, is this is not a war on the post office, which has always been a target, but this is a war on the American voter. Mm-hmm. The attack on the post office and the try to discrediting of the post office and the throwing stones in the gears of the machinery of the post office is a deliberate attempt. It's a tactic in the strategy of stealing the election or trying to steal the election. That's why this is being done, particularly at this time. I'm willing to wager, and I've not seen any numbers, and I don't know if they exist, that if somebody was able to analyze where the post boxes were removed from and where the machinery that high-speed sorts them, these would be affecting in blue state and blue district areas. There's no question in my mind about it. That is the strategy. The Democrats seem to have a strategy of urging people to vote early, to take advantage of mailing their ballots or early voting in the states that allow that. The Republicans, in discrediting the Postal Service, are basically encouraging their voters to vote in person, which leads one to the undisputable conclusion that Trump expects to be better with the walk-in votes on actual election day, and the Democrats think they're going to do better later on. So the great fear of those of us who usually don't subscribe to conspiracy theories is that Trump will be ahead on election day ballots that are opened on that day, and the rest that are more time-consuming to open and count will be Democratic votes, and he will declare victory on election night, causing a constitutional crisis of unmeasurable enormity. How do you respond to that, Jerry?
Thank you, Gary, and we miss you in Congress, and we miss all of my colleagues, including Steve, of course, and Elizabeth was about to get on. We really do. I told the story of my own primary. There was a 15-point difference between day of voting physically and mail-in ballot. 15 points. So if that's illustrative of what we can expect only on a partisan difference, your point is absolutely correct. There's going to be a big gap in many places between the results tabulated from day of voting versus results tabulated from early voting and mail-in voting. And I think we can expect that. Your other point, I think, goes to voter suppression. The attempts to delay and disrupt the mail that have been undertaken by the new Postmaster General, I think, are all about voter suppression. So, you know, where my friends on the other side of the aisle have taken over state governments, they have aggressively pursued voter suppression methods. Strict voter ID laws, getting rid of same-day voter registration, limiting or eliminating early voting, limiting or eliminating satellite voting places for people to vote early, long lines, fewer machines, you know, consolidating precincts, especially in minority communities. All of that is very, and purging voting rolls. You know, 5 million Americans were purged from voting rolls. I would just point out that Obama's margin in 2012 in his reelection was 4 million. That's a very significant number. And I think Trump and company saw a golden opportunity when they saw how many people, because of the pandemic, were going to switch and vote by mail. You had an opportunity by disrupting the mail to actually suppress the vote in every state, whether you were in charge or not. And that's what, to me, is so monstrous about what was undertaken. Trump almost said it, right? He said, well, we're not going to give them the money. If they don't have the money, they can't vote by mail. And he has also said, voting by mail hurts Republicans. Not true, but he said it. Voting by mail will be massive fraud. Not true. In fact, the only real case of harvesting, you know, absentee vote ballots was ironically in North Carolina by a Republican. So if you want to look for voter fraud, we found it, but it wasn't Democrats and it wasn't independents, it was Republicans who were actively engaged in North Carolina, so much so that the local electoral board threw out the results of that primary, which is a very rare event in America. That's how serious it was. So, and that person who was harvesting those votes is still under indictment. I think we have to take this very seriously, and that's why the stakes about the Postal Service are so high right now. And remember that early voting has begun.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And finally, final question, the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Elizabeth Esty.
Well, thank you, Steve. And Gerry, great to see you.
Great to see you and hear you again, Elizabeth.
I want to continue on the same theme. My daughter was one of the top people on voter protection for Team Hillary in 2016. And what she shared with me recently was quite disturbing, which is based on the research they did at that point for Democratic voters, particularly irregular Democratic voters, it was incredibly important to be reassured that your vote was going to be counted and that it was safe and secure. So in the environment that we're in now, we are now at a point, as you rightfully are having your hair on fire about what's being done at the post office, we have this conundrum. Because if we use, I think, the message of fear and the system's broken and it's going to be stolen, that's Trump's territory. His voters thrive on that, and they're now trying to defend their guy, right? So they're going to turn out to ensure that that happens. Whereas, sadly, quite a number of folks who feel they have been disrespected and the process is rigged against them for generations may hear that message from Democrats.
Yeah.
And so your thoughts on that, can we use language, continue to keep it safe and reliable, protect
Yes.
it, because I think that, and you use that in this conversation, but I would tell you based on the research that that I've seen and that she shared with me, I think it is, we may have gone too far over to the hair on fire, it's a hoax, it's rigged, we've got it, you know, it's now out of control, because that has disproportionate impact on people who already are looking at a world in which they feel like institutions don't respect them and don't count them. So I think that is urgently important, in addition to your incredibly important oversight role.
Elizabeth, you make such a good point. And I think the polling would corroborate what you're saying. So when you do polling, a majority of Americans now think, oh, I'm not sure that I want to vote by mail. I'm not sure it will get there. I'm worried that it won't get there to be counted. That was not a worry at the beginning of the pandemic. And even though we have lots of examples of primaries that worked very well and the mail did not, you know, cause a problem, people are reading stories about ballots being invalidated because of a lack of a signature or stamp or whatever, didn't get there in time. And, you know, I don't want to take that risk. And the other risk is, okay, if I decide that my only option to that is to show up on November 3rd, the risk is something happens, right? I get the flu. I got to wash my dog, whatever the excuse, and I don't get around to voting. Now, from Trump's point of view, looking at polling that says he's got an uphill climb, every one of those votes that isn't cast, it helps his cause from his point of view. It's a very cynical point of view. And by the way, in order to do this, you've got to jeopardize other mail. So you're slowing down veterans, 80% of whom get their medications by mail. You're slowing down, you know, Social Security checks, unemployment checks to the American people in order to accomplish the short-term political goal you think you might accomplish. And it is a profoundly cynical thing using the Postal Service. And you're right, they've already got it in our heads. So I think we have to try to reassure voters that as long as they vote early. Now, if you wait to the day before the election to mail in your ballot, you're asking for trouble. Anything can go wrong. I mean, there's no guarantee that a piece of mail is going to get there the next day and be counted. So prudence says, if you want to vote by mail, and we think you should, vote early. Take advantage of your state law or your local procedure and cast that ballot as soon as you can, so that you're not risking anything. And you will be fine, as long as you sign it and all that good stuff. Now, some states, of course, also require witnesses. Now, interestingly, DeJoy sent down a missive that told postal workers they can no longer be witnesses for ballots. Now, why is that small change important? Well, there are a lot of people who go to the post office and fill in their ballots there. They turn to a postal worker and say, will you witness this ballot, because the state requires a witness. To tell them now, well, you're going to have to find someone else, but because our employees are banned from being a witness for a ballot, which, by the way, they've always been able to do, may seem like a small change, but it further clouds the ability of people to get their ballot in correctly and on time. And it further removes the Postal Service from being an ally in that process. And that's by design, not by accident.
Congressman, I want to thank you for an extraordinary session. You know, you and I and our former colleagues and everybody understands that there are some things that are fair game for partisanship, taxes and regulation and even war and peace at times. But the post office now, for the first time, being such a prominent target and feeding into the hyper-partisanship is very disturbing. What makes us feel better is that there are people like you safeguarding our democracy, holding the Board of Governors' feet to the fire, and we're going to continue to count on you to do just that. Thank you so much for joining us and for extending your time. Folks, Thursday night at 7, former Congressman Robert Mrazek discussing his wonderful book, The Indomitable Florence Finch. Thank you, everybody, and please stay safe. Congressman, thanks again.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you, Doug.